professor at the Feinstein College of Education, and serves as the program director for the College Student Personnel Program here at URI. He brings a wealth of experience in student affairs and will be guiding tonight's discussion. It is also my honor to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Dominique Baker. Dr. Baker is an associate professor of education and public policy at the University of Delaware, with a joint appointment in the College of Education and Human Development, and at the Joseph R. Biden Jr. School of Public Policy and Administration. Her research examines how education policy shapes access and success for minoritized students in higher education. She has testified before Congress on student loan policy, and her expertise has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. Dr. Baker was the 2023 recipient of the American Educational Research Association's Early Career Award and a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow. She holds a PhD from Vanderbilt University, and both her master's and bachelor's degrees are from the University of Virginia. Tonight, Dr. Baker will help us better understand the critical intersection between public policy and U.S. colleges and universities, particularly in today's volatile political climate. Her talk will offer timely commentary on pressing issues in higher education, including state and federal funding, college affordability, and the evolving mission of our higher education system. So please join me in welcoming both Dr. Camacho and Dr. Baker to the stage.
Thanks, man. What's good, everyone? Happy Tuesday. Thank you for joining us for this conversation today. I have the gotta stop touching the mic. I have the extreme pleasure of having an opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Baker tonight on her really important and interesting work. I've had the chance to hang out with her for part of the day, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and I think you'll enjoy the chance to get to meet her through her work as much as I have. And so what I'd like to do is let folks in the audience get a chance to get to know you, Dr. Baker, just a little bit better before we jump into some of the questions that we'll be tackling tonight. And so to do that, yes, we just had a chance to listen to your formal bio, but I'd really like folks in the audience to have a chance to meet you through your sense of positionality.
Sure.
Who is Dr. Dominique Baker? What brings her to the work she does in higher education? And particularly her work central to funding policy.
Yeah, well, thank y'all so much for coming out. I think one of the critical pieces to me and the work that I do is that I am the youngest of 5 children. And when you are the youngest of 5 children, there are a lot of things that are like shown to you that like, oh, this is how life is supposed to be, right? Like this is the sports that people are supposed to play. These are the decisions people are supposed to make after high school, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, it was always assumed that I would go to college. My brothers in general, except for one who had enlisted in the Air Force, went to college after high school, and so that was the thing that I was probably going to do, right? But I found it curious that other members of my family, it was not assumed that they would be going to college. And that puzzled me because my cousins were just as smart as me. We come from literally the same family. And so that didn't make sense to me. And it was a thing that I could see in other people's families, in my friends' families, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I was an undergrad, a thing I kept thinking about was, why do certain people think that college is a choice for them? And why do certain people think that it's not a choice for them? And that eventually led me to working in admissions, to doing research, thinking about colleges and universities. And you can't think about why people make a choice around whether or not to go to college without thinking about money. Whether that's how much money your family has, how much money the college has to provide resources, to provide tutoring, to provide talks like this. It all often comes back down to money. And so in order to better understand how we set up the choices that we provide to different people in our country, I felt that I had to better understand how we allow the flow of money to work in the United States regarding colleges and universities, but also sort of the larger elements of our lives.
I think that's really interesting that you've thought about sort of the place of college in relationship to funding and who has access to it and who doesn't have access to it. I think that particular topic is especially relevant today, right? Particularly in our, what I think I would call a volatile political climate, where there's debates over diversity, curriculum, free speech, that have not only begun to occur more regularly, but have intensified, right? They've really become a regular staple of national and local conversations. Given sort of where we are in this national conversation, how do you make meaning of the public mission of higher education?
Oh, wow. We're starting off very soft. It's not difficult at all. Don't worry about it. Super simple. The public mission of higher education. So on the surface, right, it seems like, oh, it's in the name. Especially, right, like for public universities, right? The public mission is the public. But then you start to ask yourself, okay, so like who's public? Who counts as a member of the public? Do people that live in the state of Rhode Island who never once stepped foot on this campus, are they members of the public that are served by the University of Rhode Island? If so, how? In what ways? Are people who live in Rhode Island and work on campus served by the University of Rhode Island? If so, how? In what ways? Right? Like, public gets messy in some ways by design, right? Like that's the thing about the public. Is it can mean a lot of things. It can encompass a lot of different groups of people. And to me, when I think about the public mission of higher education, and in particular public universities, I think about ways of serving our society in advancing sort of our democracy, for lack of a better, that's a super low-key way of thinking about it, I guess. So, right, what does it mean for a university to promote our society, to promote advancing our country? What does it look like when research is conducted that helps to make a better world, a better tomorrow than it was yesterday? What does it mean to produce graduates who go on to found nonprofits and programs that help people to gain access to stable housing, to stable food? Like those sorts of things matter for me just as much as thinking about the salary that people get after they graduate from an institution.
I think you and I share the same ideas around the public mission, but I think that's probably a lot to do with the work that we do in higher education and many of the reasons that we were probably both driven to do some of this work, first as practitioners and then eventually as faculty and as scholars, right? Do you feel like this might be a loaded and leading question, but do you feel like that is a common sort of perception amongst folks across the nation at large, given sort of how you've defined the public mission of education?
I think I will take a step back and say that I don't know that everyone, agrees that there is a public mission of U.S. higher education. And then from there, we again get into that very messy question of who's public. And what does it mean to serve that public, right? So often when we talk about thinking about public goods, we also think of like a sort of the other side of the coin, right? That's the private good. So when we think about higher education as a private good, we're typically talking about things like how much additional earnings did one person get after graduating from an institution, which can be very important. But if you only focus on the earnings that an individual person gets after the time that they spent at a college or university, you can wind up in an environment where the only thing that we're thinking about is what are the economic returns for one individual person. And what we start to lose are all those other very messy things, but things that I think are still worthwhile around how does that institution contribute to furthering society that sort of goes beyond just an individual person's W-2, right? An individual person's income that they're receiving. So I think that for some people, the focus should be, in their mind, on the private good parts of higher education and not so much on the public good side. And then beyond that, right, I think that there are some people who would define who the public is that is served by colleges and universities in a more narrow way than I would define that public. As just one example, I believe that when universities are serving the public, that includes people who are not citizens of the United States. So that there may be people who reside in Rhode Island and Delaware who can be served by an institution even if they are not a citizen of the United States.
So what I'm hearing is, right, that depending on your perspective, the definition around public good and the public mission of higher education could vary wildly, right? And so I think that leads us to a place of how we sort of approximate value, appropriate value. And so bringing this back full circle to this idea around funding policy and how funding shows up as a part of this conversation related to why you're here and why we're having this conversation today. I guess I want to learn a little bit more about how you think states at large sort of affix value to higher education, right? And so for the purposes of our public who may or may not know as much about funding in higher education, funding comes from a variety of spaces, some of it federal, lots of it from the state, some of it from private and philanthropic endeavors, and then there's whole conversations around tuition and fees and things of that nature. And thinking about how state funding is a large driver of funding for higher education across the institution, I think it's important that we, at least for us in this particular space, have an operationalized definition of what funding means, what it looks like, so that we're all on the same page. So for the benefit of our attendees, would you offer a brief overview of state funding formulas and why that's relevant to a conversation around funding policy?
Sure. These are very sexy topics. So I'm going to talk to you about a lot of what spreadsheets look like. So when we think about colleges and universities, completely accurate to say that we get funding from a lot of different spaces. The feds, state governments, depending on the institution, localities can give money, cities, counties, students and their families provide a substantial portion of funding as well. But when we think about the states, the overwhelming majority of the money that states provide to colleges and universities is through appropriations. So this means that generally speaking, every year, every 2 years, the legislature says this is how much money we're going to give to institutions in our state. And they can do that in tons of different ways. So they can say, how much money did we give you last year? We're gonna bump that up by 2%, and that's how much money you're gonna get this year. They can say, how many students do you enroll? And we're gonna give you X amount of money for every student that enrolls. Or they could say, what's the share of students who graduated last year? And if you're above a certain threshold, we'll give you additional money. And then there's some states that say, we're just gonna do it on vibes. Like, we have no formula, we have no rules, we will give you however much money this year we decide to give you, and we could choose a completely different way for how we will give you money next year. I work with a collective of researchers where we spend an inordinate amount of time poring over state budgets in order to better understand how funding is distributed across the United States. And one of the things we always say is that if you know one state, you know one state. There's very little that transfers across different states in how they handle the funding of colleges and universities, which, makes things fun.
Wow, that was a lot. Yeah. In thinking about what you shared with us, what do you think that says about sort of the state funding formulas, budget priorities?
Yep.
How does that reflect the state's political values and or commitments to access to education through funding?
Right, so like there's the saying that you show me a budget, I show you what you value. And that is most definitely true in state budgets. I think it's always important to keep in mind that states fund a lot of things. States fund healthcare, states fund often the roads. There are a number of ways that states support the residents within that state. And so while higher education is a priority, it's not always the number one priority. And so we can see as we look at different elements of state budgets, just where in the priority list higher education can fall, and in particular, different higher education institutions, right? There are states that have many different four-year institutions and community colleges, and often the budgets can provide different amounts of money to different institutions, which can also tell you something about which types of institutions are valued. And one of the things I tell my students in my higher ed policy classes is I tell them to look at the funding decisions that a state makes and look at the policy solutions that are adopted, and then think about from there, what is the problem that the state is identifying with higher education? So a big example of this with funding is something called performance-based funding. This is a funding formula that sort of says, okay, we're going to identify some success metrics. We could define success as the number of degrees that a university produces, the graduation rate, all sorts of things. And so we're going to say that based on how well an institution does with that, we will give, the state will give the institution some additional amount of money. The tricky thing that I talk to my students with, and I use this as an example, I sort of say, okay, think about it. If you were telling an institution that we are concerned about graduation rates, and so we are going to allot certain amounts of money based on graduation rates, what do we think the actual problem is that is being identified? And typically where we come to, I have them listen to clips from governors, state legislators, all sorts of things. And typically what we come to is a space of, well, we think the institution could have a higher graduation rate. They just aren't motivated enough. And so if we tell them that the only way they get this extra money is they have to have a higher graduation rate, they have to produce additional degrees, that will increase the incentive. That will motivate the institutions to have a higher graduation rate, produce more degrees, et cetera, et cetera. And so the only way that that works, right, is if the only thing that's missing is motivation. If there's any chance that the reason an institution has a lower graduation rate is because, I don't know, they need more resources to be able to adequately educate their students, big if true. If that's the case, then actually tying funding to the graduation rate is probably actually going to harm students more than help them, because what the institution needed was more resources for tutoring supports or more resources to be able to make smaller class sizes by being able to hire more instructors. So those types of things are, when we go, I say sort of excavating the budget, those are the types of things that we look for to see what are sort of the revealed values at play when we think about how colleges and universities are funded?
So you're telling me that if I'm motivated enough, I can get something done.
You can go anywhere.
As a staff member, as a faculty member, maybe even as a student, right?
Do you need cash? I thought that people could live on hopes and dreams. And that was not necessary.
Have I just not been praying hard?
It's a thing that, the same way that we talk in schooling and we say that, and this is something that I was talking with some students about earlier today, if a student goes to school and then when they come home, they do not have stable housing or they do not have ready access to affordable food, we think a lot of people think that's a problem. and think that there's only so much that a school can do if a student does not have food to be able to eat at night. And so there are some problems for which motivation only gets us so far. And without resources and access to be able to ensure that someone has sort of the capacity to be able to succeed, it shouldn't be shocking if we don't see the types of results that we were hoping for.
So I know you've shared that there's limits to this conversation around motivation, right? Whether you want to call it grit, moxie, persistence, however motivation shows up, right? But I want to extend this idea just a little bit longer, if you'll allow me to, right? Another really big national conversation that's been on the forefront for the last several years centers topics around student loans. So surely if motivation's all that matters, we should be motivated to be responsible with student loans. We should be motivated to pay them back, maybe. But I wonder if that's the appropriate way to be framing this conversation. How should the everyday individual ground their understanding of student loan debt in order to have a well-informed understanding and our conversation around that topic?
Yeah, so student loans. I dream about student loans. That is how much so this is one of my areas that I spend a lot of time doing research on. I often tell other researchers who are just getting into thinking about doing this type of research, one of the things that I do a ton of is I hang out in like message boards and forums that focus on student loans. So I am constantly in the subreddits that focus on student loans. There are places like Lipstick Alley, all these sorts of places that I spend a ton of time just lurking, in part to try to better understand like how are people dealing with their loans? How are people experiencing them? What questions do they have, et cetera, et cetera. And that fuels like the research I do, the policy recommendations I make, et cetera, et cetera. So part of this will be fueled by all of those types of things that I do in addition to like what I know from the research. And like I am the youngest of 5, which means I'm also an aunt to 9 really great nieces and nephews, so I hear a lot about student loans from them as well. So one of the things that I really try to help people to think about is that for a very long time in the United States, we had a system set up where colleges and universities would sort of price tuition to be really, really low. And they would say that basically we made it really low, so because of that, we only need like a small amount of financial aid to help students to be able to enroll, and we call this low tuition, low aid, that because we price tuition so low, it's only a few people who can't afford it, and we'll help those few people out. Then along the way, particularly moving into the 80s and 90s, we sort of shift our understanding of US higher education, and we move into this space of high tuition, high aid. So this is an environment where colleges and universities can charge whatever they would like, and the sort of argument is we'll do some testing to figure out how much can a student and their family afford, and then the gap in between what the family can afford and what the college price is will be covered through some mixture of financial aid. That shift fundamentally when we talk about publics and private goods, right, that starts us down an interesting pathway of really focusing on a strong shift in students and their families shouldering a much larger share of the burden of paying for college than they ever had before. As that shift is happening, we start getting interesting turmoil in our financial markets, in particular things like the Great Recession that happens in 07, 08, creates a confluence of events where people are interested in going to college. They don't have a ton of money because we've shifted to this strong system of high tuition and high aid, and so it means that people are more likely to rely on student loans in order to go to college. And we reduced some of the regulation around which colleges are considered to provide a quality education. And so this allows institutions, not all, but a larger share of for-profit institutions than the not-for-profit institutions wind up to start charging really high tuition and not necessarily delivering on the quality education part. So all of those things mixed together, where we have a world where a large number of students relied really heavily on student loans to go to college for degrees that were not really high quality. And that is our very real current environment that we have to deal with, is thinking about things like, if we reduce how much people borrow from student loans, what do we replace that money with? Are there grants that we create to help students to be able to go? Do we reduce how much revenue colleges and universities have? Because if so, as I was talking with students earlier, that typically means that when we reduce the revenue that a college has, they have to reduce the quality of instruction that they provide to students because they have less money to do something with, right? I'm not talking about the institutions that are like rich, right? That like have very large billion-dollar endowments. I'm talking about institutions like the University of Rhode Island that tries to be a good steward of its funds, but also doesn't have $1 billion to be able to tap into. So you have to make decisions, right, about, like I said, what happens if you remove those student loans? Where's the money going to come from? Or are you going to cut how much money an institution has, which will change how they're able to teach? How do we make decisions about which universities should be allowed access to the student loan system, to financial aid sort of writ large? When do we say that an institution is basically scamming students? And so they shouldn't be allowed to charge exorbitant prices that students then have to take out a ton of student loans in order to be able to attend and get degrees that might be worthless. Right, so like it's a very convoluted, complex piece where we have an environment that students and their families are shouldering just a much more substantial part of the burden of paying for college than they ever had to before. But there is not a clear automatic solution about what one would do to fix that, especially to fix that across the United States. Because remember, the same way I was talking about, one state, it is also true that people that live in different states have different pricing. I was reading in the student newspaper about the shifts around pricing for the data science program here at the University of Rhode Island. And what it amounted to is that students who lived in other states could attend the University of Rhode Island at the in-state rate if they were getting the data science degree, if they came from a New England state, because there was no data science program in their home state. But once a data science program in their home state was created, the sort of compact that these states have disappears. And that means that these students now have to pay the out-of-state rate. Well, that's a fundamental change in how students are paying, how affordable college is, what their price looks like. And that's solely based on the fact that they happen to have been born and lived in a different state. So it gets really tricky very quickly, but like that's sort of the top line of how we think about the world of student loans. I should also mention, the other thing is, if you take nothing else from this today, anytime you hear in a news story, anything like that, someone mentioned like, oh, so-and-so has $100,000 in student loan debt, you automatically know that that person either took out private student loans or they attended graduate school. The reason that I say that is because there are actually lifetime limits for how much students are allowed to borrow in federal student loans. And part of the reason I bring that up is because sometimes I can say all those other things, right, about the concerns I have, how much debt load people have taken out, but it is also true at the same time that the people we're most concerned with around student loans, they have about $10,000 to $20,000 in student loan debt. People in general who have $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in student loan debt are often people who have gone to medical school, who have gone and gotten graduate degrees. That's not everyone, right? But it is a large share of people. And so that is an additional complicating factor that when we talk to members of the public, when we talk to policymakers, one of the biggest things that I always make sure that I lead with is thinking about the fact that the people who struggle the most in repaying their student loan debt typically have between $10,000 and $20,000. And so it often upends people's ideas around how much money we would have to put towards something like potential loan cancellation or something of that nature if we wanted to help people that were struggling the most.
So it sounds like if we allow ourselves to have a conversation around financing in higher education, particularly as it relates to student loans, we recognize that if we move beyond motivation, there's so many elements to this.
Yes.
It's a multifaceted system that informs students' educational pathways at a variety of layers, levels, and spaces and places.
Yes, and I think one of the things that was like a huge mind shift for me is that often researchers, policy analysts, et cetera, spend a ton of time thinking about like the choice that someone made. Why did you choose to attend the University of Rhode Island versus the University of Delaware, right? Spend an inordinate amount of time focused on that. And what I'm most interested in are the choice sets we give people. Why was one person's set of choices the University of Rhode Island and the University of Delaware, and another person's set of choices Brown and Harvard? What happened that made it so that these groups of people got different sets of choices? I'm especially interested when this is true across the United States, where there are lots of people who have the same amount of intelligence, the same amount of proven academic ability, who have very different sets of choices that have been provided to them because of a variety of things in our country. And so I am always interested in trying to think about what set of choices did we give people rather than sort of narrowing in just on what choice did you make between A and B.
I feel like what you're sharing with us is this conversation around funding in higher education, particularly in the US and public education, is this scenario that sort of lives within a greater system.
Yes.
And I want to, maybe for our audience members, create a deeper connection systematically between funding and admissions.
Sure, yeah.
And the role of like test scores, right? So across your research, from studies of admissions lotteries to your work on recommendation letters and extracurricular reporting, you've shown how inequity persists even when test scores are removed. While some institutions have made the decision to bring those back, many of them have foregone them, right, as a part of the admissions process.
Yes.
So as artificial intelligence becomes more common in admissions and accountability, what opportunities and risks do you see for equity and access?
Yeah, so I will start from a space that when we think about structures that create inequity, so structures that make it so that some people have less money and have less opportunity with whatever innate talents and skills that they have been given. One of the sort of key things to keep in mind is that we have pretty good evidence that power will find a way. So that people who have additional resources and additional opportunities will find ways or strongly attempt to find ways often in order to make the most of those resources and additional opportunities. And so that doesn't mean that just because, as an example, just because we can see patterns of inequity in things like the reported extracurriculars that students share when they apply to go to college, or in the reference letters that counselors or teachers write, like just because we can see patterns of that, it doesn't mean that then the only solution is that one must require test scores. Because it would be a quote unquote sort of like objective measure. In fact, right, we could have an entire talk about like what is an objective measure. And so the fact that like someone could wake up and eat a banana or not eat a banana and that could shift their SAT scores, we could have questions about just what an objective measure of someone's innate abilities is. But so with that, we I think, have an interesting road where within admissions where not all students apply, admissions professionals get a ton of information and they get to assess from there who are the students that seem to make the most sense to have an offer of admission provided to them. And they use a ton of information, which can include test scores, can include, as I mentioned, right, like extracurriculars, essays, letters of reference, looking at the actual transcript, right, the courses that a student took, their grades, their GPA, all of those different pieces. And like, as someone who used to work in admissions, I read applications and made admissions recommendations. Right, it actually takes a ton of time for me to sit down and make sure that I feel like I understand the type of high school that someone went to, the opportunities provided by that high school, the number of AP classes that were offered at the high school, those types of things, in order to be able to then think, for this institution, does this make sense? Does this fit? Blah, 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 blah. I do a ton of training in order to prepare to be able to do something like that. And then in addition, there are other people, right, that like when you're first learning to be an admissions counselor, that like will review the decisions that you make, the recommendations that you make in order to make sure that like you're learning what feedback you need to get to keep improving in your practice. I say all that to say that a computer program is unlikely to replicate the methods that an individual person who is trained can do. Now, we can always start out with the point of like, anytime typically someone asks me something about AI, I often ask them what AI means to them. Because technically we have like let AI basically mean everything and nothing at the same time. The way that some people define AI, the spell check that you use in a Word document is AI, because it uses large language models and patterns to guess at when they think you've done a typo or when the grammar isn't correct, blah, 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 blah. And so I'm always curious what people mean when they say AI. I will say that there are predictive analytics that are already being used in college admissions. And frequently when this happens, this is where institutions are trying to guess which students they think will enroll and which students they think will do well at their institution. And so they may feed some of the information from the application into basically, we could say, right, like an algorithm, a formula, right? It's basically like a math equation type thing, where you say, I'm gonna put in this information about this person, a GPA, the courses they've taken, and based on information, whatever that math equation has been trained on, right? So it might have been trained on hundreds of thousands of previous applicants' information, and then they look at those students who enrolled and they say, okay, did you come back for a second year? Did you graduate within 4 years? Blah, 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 blah. And based on all of that previous information that they were trained on, it could make predictions to say, it's likely that this student would do well at your institution, or it's likely that this student would enroll if you gave them an offer. And so that is already a thing that happens at some institutions, but that's always done in concert with like a real person. So I think that it's incredibly difficult. I think that there are worlds where people could choose to do that. I do think that at a certain point, people would actually get really uncomfortable with that. I'll give an example. So I've done research before looking at admissions lotteries. 9 times out of 10, you start talking about like inequities within the admissions system to go to colleges in the United States. And someone will say, I've got a solution. I know how to fix it. Get a lottery. Put a lottery, it's basically, I'm very old, because I immediately thought of a television show called Portlandia where they had a joke about putting a bird on things. And so it was just like their motto to say, put a bird on it. But basically, in admissions, frequently people say that the solution is just put a lottery on it. That'll solve everything. And we actually tried that with an institution in Illinois. a couple of decades ago, and they said, we're going to create a lottery, and students will apply, and as long as they've covered a certain threshold, we're just going to randomly pick which students get to be admitted and which ones don't. They do that. It is a disaster, and that is because everybody who the lottery didn't pick is all of a sudden mad. They love holistic admissions. They want holistic admissions back. And that's because more often than not, when we talk about math formulas, when we talk about lotteries, things like that, people say that that's what they want. But that's because in general, they think that that process would privilege them in the admissions process. And then when it doesn't happen, they are pissed. And so they are like, no, no, no. And in fact, that institution that tried it, and then everybody got very angry, they scrapped the lottery, and all the students that were rejected were admitted. Because that is how like high key of a like politically volatile moment that was for them. So people say that they would love a very objective, numbers-based environment where these types of decisions would be made, and no one means it. Also, if you believe that like AI will give you an objective, we could have a separate talk about the objectivity of a computer.
I feel like, not to diminish everything, or not to minimize everything you've just said, but I feel like while AI can do lots of really great things, I feel like it's also potentially capable of reinforcing biases in the things that we say. We could try to program out of the algorithm. You know, maybe that might be human error, or might be human oversight, or human bias in some way. I feel like AI might do the same thing.
So a big thing that I said, and what I was just talking about, right, was like, oh, we got to train whatever our little math formula is. Whatever our equation is that we're popping into this little calculator, right, we have to give it something to know, like, well, why would this person have a high probability of graduating and this person wouldn't? Or why would this person have a high probability of enrolling and this person wouldn't? You have to train it on something. Part of the big kerfuffles about large language model chatbots, right, things called like ChatGPT, is that in order to train, because you need a ton of information to train these things, these companies, they're going to sue me, it wasn't alleged, but for the recording purposes, allegedly, stole all of this writing from people. That's books, that's my articles, top to bottom, things that people own and worked hard on, they stole, allegedly. I don't have the money I can't fight a ChatGPT lawsuit. They have billions more than I do.
You don't got billions?
They are not paying professors that these days. But one of the big things, right, is they had to have a ton of information. And a thing that founders and owners of these companies like ChatGPT have actually said on the record to journalists is that if they had to pay everybody for the stuff that they stole to train their math equations, they go bankrupt. There's no way that they'd ever be able to pay people. So think about that. That means that if we were going to train some sort of admissions bot to be able to do the work that humans do, we would need a ton of information. It's not the case that like you could have just 5 applications that have been done previously by a human. You need hundreds of thousands of applications in order to train whatever predictive algorithm you're trying to create. And there are multiple facets in here that in particular, you can think about some of this being around human bias, but also you can only teach the algorithm like so much. Computers are not sentient, right? And that means that everything that the computer does, it's really working with an if-then statement. If I see this, then that. They are not actually, the part of why our AI is a misnomer, it is not artificially intelligent. It is just, at most, like these generative chatbots that we're talking about, right? At most, it's sort of like a spicy autocomplete. Like they're doing auto-completion based on the words that you gave them and all of their training data. And so Because of that, it means that when I, as a human, review an application and I say that I know where this student went to high school and I have an idea about the opportunities that this student was provided at that high school, I have a good understanding of the context and background. This is what we do with holistic admissions, that the student experienced. I have some ideas around both admission, whether or not they would enroll, and some ideas around whether or not they might graduate, especially depending on the resources we put into helping the student. So what does it mean if we admit a student, but we have, what does it mean if we admit a student who attended a high school that has less funding, and then we provide no resources for tutoring, for support, to help the student to be able to excel at our institution? It might mean, right, that student doesn't graduate, and a lot of that could be on us, right, the institution's fault. The computer doesn't know that. And so what the computer says is students that look like that, they don't graduate, because it's an if-then statement. And so there are, computers are great. I use it every day. There are a lot of ways that these math equations and predictive algorithms can be useful, but it's always really important to understand the context of how they can be useful and the context when they are not. And you know, that's, I think, a thing, and I'll let you go. I won't get on my soapbox, but U.S. higher education, in some ways, it feels like, is not always thinking about the sort of what do quote unquote AI companies get out of it just as much, if not more, than what the university itself can get out of it. And what I mean is we have a lot of colleagues that do stuff like studying education technology and studying the companies that run these programs, how their money works. And what you can see when you look at things like data center funding, the investment that companies are putting into the data centers that run a lot of these types of things that actually then could create the types of programs that we're talking about. For a number of them, like, they are not turning a profit. ChatGPT is not, like, that is a thing, that they are losing money. And one of the easiest ways for them to get money is actually to become a standard part of colleges and universities and K-12 schools. If they can get contracts in order to solidify that work, that's a steady stream of income. And so that doesn't mean that those things can't matter and can't be useful in some scenarios, but I also think it's important that when we think about for-profit companies or the for-profit foundation arms of companies, because ChatGPT used to be solely considered a nonprofit, but they decided that they wanted to pay the CEO more money, and so in part decided that they needed to build out a for-profit portion. And so those are companies that are interested in making money. They're not necessarily companies that are interested in ensuring you admit a strong and robust and diverse class of students.
Yeah, so it's for us, by us. We're
Yes.
all about the profit, and we'll keep selling you a dream, if you will, that could or could not achieve what we're hoping for, but maybe eventually we'll kick that can down the road long enough that we'll keep being able to charge you for it.
We will sell you products that students could use to create assignments, and then we will sell you products that faculty can use to both detect if students used the product and to grade students' assignments.
Doc, as most conversations that are good have happened, is that time flies by. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to try to sneak in at least one or two more questions before
Sure.
we maybe not say goodbye to each other, but say goodbye to these folks in the audience, right? I want to get back to this idea around privilege that you mentioned when you were talking about sort of these these admissions lotteries,
Sure.
and in relationship to sort of how AI supposedly fixed that, didn't fix that, right?
Sure.
And I want to sort of think about this idea around privilege maybe a little bit differently.
Okay.
So from a funding perspective, we have institutions that have historically been situated to prioritize marginalized students.
Okay.
Right? But we've recently seen some executive action that's paused or stopped funds to institutions that maybe prioritize the servingness of specific demographics or prioritize federal mandates, maybe like TRIO or things of that nature. What role should state and federal policymakers play in supporting institutions that have intentionally served marginalized students?
Yeah. So we'll talk hypothetically about a hypothetical federal government. That one, if we believe, and so this is part of the reason why thinking about higher education as a public good, if we believe that there are these ways that higher education can contribute that go far beyond the individual earnings that students that attended receive, then we would think that there are ways that the federal, state, local governments would want to ensure that was protected, that public mission and public ethos and public servingness was protected, and that would be even more true for the institutions committed to the education of sort of the broadest swath of students you could think about. There are a number of ways that those levels of government could contribute to helping students, and it can run from things like we think about making it easier for students to gain access to bus passes and steady access to food outside of the certain hours at the college or university, right? Like those are actual things that state and local governments can do. When it comes to the federal government, there are a number of things that the feds do that both include things like research funding that help to create amazing advances in science, but also like really tasty apples. If you've tasted like a delicious apple that is not a Red Delicious, because Red Deliciouses are terrible. If you've tasted a delicious apple in the US, like 8 times out of 10, it was created at a US land-grant public university. So like the University of Minnesota makes baller apples. Like they have like just trust me on this. So like those are all sorts of different types of things that universities do that are often funded in part by the federal government. But the feds also, right, hold institutions accountable. So they are the ones in concert with states that are supposed to work to help ensure that quality education is being delivered. Because there's also the case, right, that there are institutions that want to take advantage of that set of students in particular. This is especially true when we talk about for-profit institutions. The typical student that attends a for-profit institution is a Black woman who is a little bit older and often has someone that she is caring for, whether that is children, an older family member, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a role to be played by, in particular, the federal government, but also state governments in thinking about how you ensure that those types of institutions don't take advantage of people who are desperate for financial stability and security in their lives. That is not necessarily the tact that is currently being taken by the current administration. And so I do think that if one is interested in the public good nature of higher education and in thinking about the institutions that serve the broadest share of students in the United States, you would want to be thinking not just about like in a hypothetical world what can happen, but also what needs to happen to rebuild. Because, right, as I currently sit here, there is basically no longer an office within the Department of Education that focuses on students with disabilities. And so that means that college and universities, but also K-12 schools, can now shirk their responsibilities if they would like when it comes to ensuring an adequate quality education for students with disabilities. And the federal government does not have an accountability mechanism in order to say, nope, you're not allowed to do that. hey, you're supposed to have a wheelchair ramp there to ensure that that student can gain access to the classroom. Like those types of things currently cannot happen because the office that focuses on special education as we know it has been dismantled. So it is not just thinking about like in an ideal bubble, but like we would actually have to think about what would it take to rebuild the systems that we had in place for holding institutions accountable and also finding ways to reward institutions that are working with really like the majority of college students in the United States.
So Doc, given this hypothetical situation, and hypothetically we wanted to invite our audience members into some type of active opportunity to engage in the system, to help with the rebuilding, to at least consider some active role in their a shared sense of obligation to the public good of education, right?
Yes.
Where might we invite the everyday person to participate? What, you know, whether it's through funding policy or some other mechanism that they might be able to enter in the conversation?
Yeah, so for K-12 schools, I am gonna just like, I'm not a K-12 person, but I will say that one of the best things is actually to attend school board meetings. School board meetings often are like very sparsely attended, and that is a way if you want to know the types of policies that are happening for the K-12 schools in your area, that is one of the biggest things you can do. When it comes to higher education, I will say that for faculty and staff, unions are great. Collective action and finding ways to come together with other faculty and staff is incredibly important. And for students, that student government can actually play a substantial role. And so thinking about who represents you within student government matters because they're typically the ones that are then consulted by the faculty unions, the staff unions. Even if you don't have a union, there are often ways that you can, there are member chapters of things like the AAUP that are not unions that people can join. So there are a lot of those types of collective groups. And if they are trying to find out how students are experiencing life, they typically will go to things like student governance groups in order to see. Because in fact, at present, the federal government is trying to enter a compact with 9 colleges and universities that would be the largest encroachment on institutions being able to run and make decisions about their own curriculum, who they hire, sort of that we've seen in the United States maybe since the Red Scare McCarthyism of the 1950s. And one of the things that just came out recently this week was a joint shared letter of all the student presidents or student vice presidents of every institution of the 9, even though one of those institutions has rejected that agreement. But those students are making their voices heard for their student bodies. And so that is a substantial role that students can play, even when it feels like being an undergraduate student in particular can feel sometimes like everybody just tells you what to do. They tell you how much to pay, they tell you which classes you have to, right? So there is substantial power in collective action, in talking to fellow students, in making your voices heard. Yeah.
Folks, you have a voice. We invite you to use it. Our students, our faculty, our staff, our collective university, there's a space and a place. And Dr. Baker has given us a variety of information to arm ourselves with, right? And we don't all have to agree on what the right outcome is or what the right answer is. But I think part of this collective action that Dr. Baker has talked about is being engaged and being involved, right? And so we've had a chance to get a sense of what does the public mission of higher education mean? What could it look like? Why is it valuable? We've had a chance to talk about funding policy in relationship to how state funding formula aids work, how they impact us as individuals, how they impact us as at a national and regional level. We've got to learn a little bit about student loans and why it's not that simple. We can't motivate ourselves out of good funding options, right? Even though they want us to try to. We've had a chance to maybe recognize and reconcile some ideas around why is it important to serve historically marginalized folks through specific institutions or through specific funding policies or funding mechanisms. And we've had a chance to learn a little bit about why it matters, right? And so I just want to thank Dr. Baker for sharing all these ideas, sharing these thoughts, and giving us a chance to have a place to start from. And so if you all welcome me, or join me in thanking her for her participation today, that'd be great. And so while I moderated this conversation, I may not have moderated a time as well, but I don't know if I don't know if maybe we have time. No, we don't have no time for questions, not even one? All right. One?
Oh, cool, let's go for it.
Executive, I pulled executive privilege.
Make it quick. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you for taking my question just really quickly. So you mentioned all the, I don't want to, the sort of negative things that are happening to higher education now
Sure,
with the
yes.
9 and the impact that you mentioned about disabled, individuals in education and so on. So rather than waiting for people to fix this, do you see any state action, so any action at the state level, rather than waiting 4 years or whatever,
Sure.
Hoping?
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I will say very quickly, because I understand our timing, that one of the things we can look at actually, which is not necessarily about higher ed, but we've seen that states actually form compacts around health policy, right? And so Rhode Island is in a compact that Delaware is also in, that we will share information with each other around things like when we have outbreaks, et cetera, because we cannot necessarily rely on the previous channels of information that we had. And so I, sometimes I'm a little bit surprised that we still do not have that type of environment from a higher education standpoint. Because I do think that there are ways that states could band together to think about sharing resources, information, in order to try to find ways to shore up some of what the federal government does. I do think there's a fundamental reality that the money that the federal government gives is just a stupid amount of money. And so it is very challenging for any state to replicate the money that the federal government was giving to institutions. But at the same time, I do think that strategies and things of that nature could be shared. And the resource I was talking about, I would imagine / hope that those things are happening and they're just not happening publicly. And so that's fine if that's what needs to happen. But I do think that there are alliances that could be made across particularly within states, but I think about New England, right? I think across states is fine, given the size. It makes less sense in Texas, but because of its scale. But that across the New England states, there are compacts that could be made to think in a very similar fashion to the Big Ten institutions. All of their faculty senates signed up for what is basically a NATO mutual defense compact that said that if the federal government was going to attack one of those institutions, they would work to support each other and to help each other. And I think that there are things like that that could also be done for institutions like the University of Rhode Island. Thank y'all.
Thanks, folks.
Oh, great. Okay, good. Yeah. Great work. Okay, why is yours still hot?
Chuck, mute me.
Yeah, that's.
Please mute me.